Well, hey, it's Mark Pomeroy here, subbing in for the amazing Molly, who is just about ready to start a new job. So congratulations, Molly. So she's a little preoccupied with that. Anyway, you got me today, a double dose. This is going to be a great online experience. If you're here for the first time, an extra special welcome to you. Great to have you with us. Now, whether you're here for the first time or you've been with us with our online community for a while, if you haven't yet liked this page, liked our channel, subscribed, which by the way, if you're here on YouTube, our logo is in the bottom corner, this bottom corner, and you can just tap on that and that actually will take you to subscribe. And then we always love it when you share this with your people in your sphere. Just help us reach and build more people and grow this incredible community online. Our amazing worship partner today is Gateway Worship, coming all the way from Texas. Now, we will have the lyrics on the screen. Whether you know the song or don't know the song, you can certainly pick that up and join in as we worship together.
Our hearts, our hands, we're reaching out to see you move again. We can hardly wait, come flood this place. We're ready now, it's all about to change. Let your kingdom come and let your will be done. Let your fire fall, let your fire fall. Open the heavens.
Right now, open the
took my place. You traded death so I can live again. I can live again. And at the cross you took my place. You traded death so I can live again. I can live again. 'Cause you said it is finished. Death has lost its sting. I'm forgiven. Your blood, my victory, now forever. Oh, I will stand and sing hallelujah. It is finished. Hallelujah. It is finished. At the cross you took my place. You traded death so I can live again. I can live again.
Okay, in a very meta way, I'm about to introduce myself and repeat what I'm about to say, which is that this is the 6th week of our current series, Keep the Faith. Now, if you've missed any of the first 5 weeks, you can go back and watch them on this platform, or if going portable is more where you want to be, then you can find us on your favorite podcast app. Just search for Elevate Church Perth, and where we'll be there. This series will be there. All of our previous series will be there. In fact, if your podcast app allows it, how about you subscribe to that? And every week we publish a new message, and you can join us on the journey together. Well, hey there, Elevate family and friends. Great to have you with us today for the sixth week of our series, Keep the Faith, where we're taking a little bit of a flyover of some members of what's become affectionately known as the Hall of Faith. You go to the new part of the Bible, you see a letter called Hebrews, written to the Jewish Christians of the time, and that writer in chapter 11 chose to highlight a number of people who throughout history had exhibited great faith and used that faith to allow them to be used incredibly by God to achieve incredible things. And this series is designed to ultimately inspire us and to grow our faith. But one of the things that I'm aware of when we look at some of these incredible people, Noah, Moses, Abraham, and so on, is to kind of, like be impressed by them, but maybe consider that what they did makes them and the lessons out of reach for us ordinary people. But that's just not the case. These people had dysfunction. There was just all sorts of reasons why many of them kind of ought not to have been used by God to do these great things. In fact, the very first week of this series, I went through a list of dysfunction. It is a bonkers list. If you missed that, go back and watch that on this platform or listen to it on our podcast. And I just want to double click on the fact that when you hear this list of dysfunction, it's not that we're punching down on anybody. It's that it's a reminder that God can literally use anybody He chooses to, regardless of your past. Today's Hall of Faith inductee typifies this almost like no other. Look, come closer. We're going to talk today about a woman named Rahab. Come on, lean in. Full disclosure, Rahab was a prostitute. Yes, that's right. Rahab enters the pages of history as a prostitute and then went on to become a Hall of Faith inductee. And I'm aware that many people would find this greatly encouraging. Like, if God can use a prostitute and ultimately have her inducted into the Hall of Faith, then absolutely I'm convinced that God can use me. That said, some people find this notion that God used a prostitute and ultimately she was inducted into the Hall of Faith problematic. So much so that you can read literature slicing and dicing Rahab's part in history, where some writers have tried to sanitize things. That they find that the idea that Rahab might have been a prostitute, they find that problematic. And so, they try to make her appear more respectable. That God chose a more respectable version of Rahab than a prostitute. Yes, God can use Moses and God can use Noah and God can use Abraham. That's easy to believe, but God choosing and using a prostitute. So what they've chosen to do is call her an innkeeper, like a hotelier. And you can do this too if this is something that you're like, oh yeah, prostitute, I'm not comfortable with that. Just open your Bible app and choose the find and replace function. Type in find prostitute, replace with innkeeper, and click on replace all. And you're good. Now, you've rewritten the Bible to suit your personal comfort and perspective. But that's not how it is, and that's not what happened. One thing we need to come to grips with, and whether we like it or not, is that in our culture, too many people judge other people based on the worst days of their past and assume that because of their worst days, that person is not good enough to be used by God. And I think sometimes something that's even more problematic is that too many people judge themselves based on their worst days of their past and conclude that they aren't good enough to be used by God. This assumption that God only uses good people. But if that were true, then there is absolutely no way that a prostitute could have ever been a candidate, let alone made it into the Hall of Faith. Incidentally, Rahab received an even greater honor than becoming a Hall of Faith inductee. And I'm going to talk about that at the end. So I encourage you to stick around, find out what that's all about. It's going to blow you away. So last week, we talked about Moses and drew some lessons from some of his life. He was one of the Hall of Faith inductees, and he was really known for someone who ultimately put God's plans and purposes ahead of his own popularity and convenience. And he was raised in the palace of the Pharaoh. He was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter during a time when the Israelites were living in captivity as slaves to the Egyptians. And Moses, he was born to an Israelite couple. Around the age of 40, he discovered his true identity. He discovered that he himself was actually an Israelite. He himself was a part of this group, this nation of people who were living and working in captivity as slaves in Egypt. And he started to identify with their pain, and he chose to leave the palace and embrace the pain of his people. He spent the next 40 years in the desert living as a shepherd. And then he spent his last 40 years leading the nation of Israel out of Egypt and towards the land that God had promised them. Now, we didn't get to cover any of that last 40-year slice last year. Didn't have time. It's a whole other series in and of itself. But Moses didn't ultimately get to lead the people into the promised land, and he died before they could get there, and his successor was a guy named Joshua. By the way, Joshua, incredible lessons that we can learn from him. In fact, just over a year ago, we taught this series called Warrior, all about the life and leadership lessons from Joshua. So you can go back and watch that on this platform, or head to your favorite podcast app, search Elevate Church Perth. You'll find us there, scroll back. You know what to do. But look for that series Warrior. That's one that we can learn from Joshua. Now, technically, Joshua doesn't make it into the Hall of Faith, okay? Not by name, anyway. When the Hall of Faith, or the writer of Hebrews was writing out his Hall of Faith, he got through Moses' slice, and then he moved on to this. This is the next thing we read about. By faith, the Israelites marched around the walls of Jericho for 7 days, and the walls fell flat. This was pointing to the reality that the Israelites eventually started to move into and take possession of the land that God had promised them. And while this doesn't mention Joshua by name, this actually happened under Joshua's leadership. So let's just back it up a little. Grab your smartphone, pop open the camera app, and how about you scan this flow code? It's going to take you to Joshua chapter 2. Okay, so while you're doing that, let me kind of catch you up with the context of what's happening here. Jericho was a city in the land that God had promised the Israelites. The reality was, whilst they eventually took a hold of it, as the writer of Hebrews pointed to, they didn't just walk or stroll on in or fly in on their magic carpets, because the city was fortified and it was defended and occupied. And just this alone is a reminder that obstacles aren't and don't have to be barriers, and aren't the final word to you and I taking hold of God's promises. That we're moving towards God's promises and hit an obstacle, that's not the reason to conclude that the promise was wrong or mistaken or that we should quit. Not at all. That said, it's also a reminder that taking a hold of God's promises isn't always easy or automatic. My pro tip is this: if God's promised it, whatever it is, then the question to ask isn't can I or can we? The question to ask is how can I? How can we? God's promised it, so I just need to know what He needs me to do or us to do in order to take up possession of that promise. So Joshua started work on the nation's how can we take a hold of Jericho. And he started by choosing 2 men and sent them off as spies to go and scope out this city, this walled city, this fortified city of Jericho. Well, 2 problems initially. One was, how do they get inside the city undetected? And secondly, when they enter the city, how do they remain undetected and not get caught as spies? Well, history records that built into one section of the wall of Jericho was an inn. And it was actually owned and operated by a woman named Rahab. It might have looked something like this. This is where, whilst Rahab operated it as an inn, she was a prostitute and would have had, likely had prostitutes working inside of that place on her payroll. And people would come and go from the outside of the city to the inside of the city, from the inside of the city to the inn, and so on and so forth. So there was always movement. But as it happens, the king of Jericho got wind that 2 spies from the nation of Israel had entered the city and were staying at this inn, Rahab's inn. And so he sent people down to confront Rahab, and she pretended not to know where the 2 men they said, well, where are the two Israelites that entered your inn? And she pretended, first of all, not to know where they came from, didn't acknowledge that she knew they were Israelites. And then she said to them, I don't know where they are. I can't hand them over to you. They're not here anymore. In fact, when they heard you were coming, they fled back outside of the walls, and they've made a run for it. But if you're quick, you can probably catch them. And so off they ran. But Rahab wasn't, all she was doing was throwing them off the scent, because the truth was that she'd hidden these two Israelite spies on her roof under some flax bushes. Well, here's an obvious question, obvious to me anyway. Why in the world would Rahab, a prostitute, put her life on the line for these two men? First of all, not only was she not an Israelite, she was actually a Canaanite, and the Canaanites were one of the nation of Israel's enemies. Secondly, she didn't know these two men. She had no history with them, and yet she put her life on the line for two men she'd never met to protect them and the nation that she was not only not a part of, but was effectively an enemy of. So what's important to understand, I just mentioned it a moment ago, that by virtue of the location and the nature of the business that Rahab was operating, people would come and go all the time. From the outer reaches of the region would come to her inn, and people would, and there would be stories told, and this would have gone on every day, day and night, week, month, year on year. And so Rahab would have heard a lot of things coming in from outside the walls of Jericho. Well, it's no surprise then that she said this to the two men. Before the spies were down for the night, the woman came up to them on the roof and said, I know that God has given you the land. We're all afraid. Everyone in the country feels hopeless. See, she then started listing off some of the miracles that she'd heard from outside of the walls, from people that had come in, the miracles that their God had performed, and then said, well, we'd all had the wind knocked out of us. And all because of you and God, your God, God of the heavens above and God of the earth below. Don't miss this. Right in this very moment, Rahab is starting to reveal the early signs of her journey of faith in the God of Israel. His faithfulness, she'd heard about it. His power, she'd heard about it. She was convinced that their God had already won the battle, that their God had already given them the land, even though they hadn't yet even entered the city. Already given you the land. So I'm going to say something to you that maybe some of you would never have anticipated in your wildest dreams hearing a preacher say in a church context such as this. You ready? Right now, when you read this, Joshua 2 verses 8 and verse 11, there's a prostitute preaching to you. No, not me. Rahab. Rahab is telling you and telling me, as much as she was telling the two spies at the time, all about how big our God is, how of the miracles he's already performed, that he's already won the battle, he's already given you the land, the things that he's promised you. It's simply now the question of how and when you're going to take possession of them if you apply yourself and your faith to that. Not a how can I, but a how can I. Not a can we, but a how can we. See, Rahab got this revelation by listening to stories of God's greatness. And this is the first step in someone's journey of faith, hearing about God's promises and power. we can grow our faith by diving into God's Word. Because God's Word is full of these accounts of God's greatness, accounts of God's faithfulness, accounts of God's power. Same God then, same God today, same God of the Israelites, same God of you and me. And this is why we place such a huge emphasis on consistently studying the Bible. Because it's all there. It's all there to read and to hear, to immerse yourself in. In fact, if you're not aware, you can scan this QR code. Every week, we put into the Bible app a featured Bible reading plan that follows on from the very topic that we taught that weekend. And we encourage you through the week to get into that plan and continue to build your faith. Hear and read more accounts of God's great works, God's faithfulness, God's power, God's promises, and on it goes. This is why we encourage you to consistently expose yourself to great teaching. Be here every week. If you miss a week, or if you want to add to this, get onto our podcast every week. Get consistent. Take it in, take it in, take it in. Hear about the goodness and the greatness of God. If you don't do that, you skip step one. Step two is irrelevant. Now, if you do step one, then step two looks like this: believing God's promises and power. Once again, warning, a prostitute is about to preach to you. I know that God has given you the land. Right there is an aspirational goal. And I would encourage you to set your sights on this becoming something that becomes the words that come out of your mouth. I know, God, you are who you say you are. I'm not doubting it. I'm not wondering it. I'm not just, trying to reach for it. I know you're with me and you're for me. I know you'll do what you said you'll do. I know you have good plans for me. I know my God is greater than any obstacles in front of me. I've heard it. I believe it. I know. And then step three, act on God's promises and power. And this isn't meant to be a formula, step 2, 1, 2, 3, add water, stir, and voila. It's a journey. It's a progression. And it's not just this meta journey or this meta progression of faith. It's something that we can apply to each aspect of our lives. Start hearing about God's promises and power when it comes to your health. Start believing those promises and start acting on them. When it comes to your relationships, when it comes to your finances, when it comes to your job, your career, your business, when it comes to all of the important areas in life, start hearing about God's promises and God's power in that area. Step 2, start believing them. And step 3, start acting on them. If you do this, you'll actually see the tide of your faith rising consistently in your life. Rahab got to this point, got to step 3 where she was willing to act on her faith. First of all, she hid the 2 spies, even though it would have put her life at risk. And then she didn't stop there. She said to these 2, now promise me, by God, I showed you mercy. Now show my family mercy and give me some tangible proof. A guarantee of life for my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, everyone connected with my family. Save our souls from death. So that was her plea. That was her prayer to God in that moment. Now the 2 men said 2 things. Number 1, can you lower us out of the window of your inn back outside of the city? And she had a red rope that she was able to do that with. And then they said to her, keep that rope outside of the window. Just leave it hanging there. And make sure your family stay inside the inn. And if you do these things, our God will protect you and save you. And get this. Rahab said, if that's what you say, that's the way it is. And sent them off, and they left, and she hung the red rope out the window. This is another aspirational goal. When you've prayed a prayer to God, where you've read His Word, and you get this revelation, you hear, you see, you receive what He has to say about that. An aspirational goal. God, if that's what you say, that's the way it is. No negotiation, no, well, doesn't like make sense to me, a red rope out the window. If that's what you say, that's the way it is. Her being willing to let them out the window and then hang a red rope out the window, which seemingly wouldn't have made any sense in... That was simply her acting on her faith. An outward action that demonstrated her growing faith in the God of Israel. So here's a question for you today. Is there anything specific that God's been calling you to do, like an outward action that demonstrates your growing faith? Maybe get baptized. If you haven't been baptized, get on our Elevate Church AU app and tell us you want to get baptized. We'll follow up with you. Giving financially, like starting giving or increasing your giving. And doing that is an outward action that demonstrates your growing faith in God as your provider. Maybe it's inviting someone to join you for a watch party, for our online experience. Joining you at a coffee shop to maybe just talk about spiritual matters. Someone that's not a Jesus follower yet. There'd be a whole list of things. But something specific that God's been calling you to. And maybe the reason you haven't done it is it makes no sense. Hang a red rope out a window? But it recognizes that faith is essentially useless if it doesn't result in action. This is something that Jesus' half-brother, a guy named James, same mom, different dad, made a big deal about. And he wrote a letter, it's called James, but it wasn't to James, written by James to, again, Jewish Christians. And he really double-clicked on this idea of faith only has impact if it's put into action. Dear friends, do you think you'll get anywhere in this if you learn all the right words but never do anything? Does merely talking about faith indicate that a person really has it? And then he picked out 2 Hall of Faith inductees to highlight that this is what faith in action has looked like in history. The first one was Abraham, specifically when Abraham demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice his son, which God didn't end up requiring him to follow through on, but he was willing to put his faith in action that God would ultimately provide. And then who's the second one? Was it Moses? Was it Noah? There's a whole list that James could have chosen. He only chose 2, Abraham, and the second one was Rahab. Yes, people, Rahab, the prostitute. An example, a shining example that James chose to demonstrate, to highlight somebody who put their faith in action. The same with Rahab, the Jericho harlot. Hello. Wasn't her action in hiding God's spies and helping them escape, that seamless unity of believing and doing, what counted with God? Wow. Do you think that Rahab, the prostitute, would have ever in her wildest dreams thought she was ever going to be inducted into the Hall of Faith? she was ever going to be referenced by Jesus' half-brother James as one of two of the highest examples in all of history of putting faith in action. But guess what? There's actually 3 references to Rahab in the new part of the Bible, in the New Testament. The first one is in Hebrews, we've talked about that. The second one is in James, we've talked about that. And I said at the beginning that there's actually one that's higher than all of those. And we find it in Matthew chapter 1, right in the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament of the Bible. Rahab gets a shout out. And like, Matthew chapter 1, what's Matthew chapter 1? Matthew chapter 1 is Jesus's family tree, the genealogy of Jesus. And guess who's in there? Guess who makes it into the noble genealogy of the King of Kings? Rahab. Remembered by God in history, not as a prostitute, but as a princess, because of her faith. So, I mentioned about taking an actionable step of faith, and maybe giving is that for you. Either you've never taken that step, haven't started giving financially, or maybe, like I said in the message, today might be something God's calling you to take a next step, to maybe increase your giving. Either way, it's very easy wherever you are around the world to give, to help us reach and build more people. The ways to do that are on the screen electronically. It doesn't matter, you don't have to be in Perth or Australia. You can do it right where you are, and together, let's become more effective in our mission. Hey, that's it for today, guys. Been terrific having you with us. Next week, we're going to be continuing our series, Keep the Faith, week 7. And I'm going to be teaching that. I'm already excited about it. So be here, bring someone, and we look forward to seeing you then.